All right, tonight we're down to chapter 2 and about verse 14. And I need to call your attention. We want to go through the review very, very rapidly because I want to get on through chapter 2 tonight. But as we look at chapters 1 and chapter 2, we find that chapter 1 gives us the sinful condition of the Gentiles. And in chapter 2, we have the sinful condition of the Jews. Now, we're going to see that Paul is going to show them it is exactly the same way. Now, the reason that he is doing this is because he's addressing the Jews at this point, and he's trying to show the Jews how they need salvation by faith. Now, the Jews would not normally think they needed salvation because they were the offspring of Abraham, and they had received the law, and they were circumcised. So they really wouldn't need salvation like those Gentiles needed it. That was their philosophy. But what he's showing them is that they're in the same condition. Now, chapter 1 showed the horrible condition of the Gentiles because of their actions. And all Jews would understand that and say that is right. Those terrible Gentiles need salvation that through Jesus Christ. But chapter 2 then turns to the Jews. And he's showing the Jews, you are in exactly the same condition. You also are lost because of your horrible condition, and that is because of your actions, the thing that you have done. So that is what we're dealing with in chapter 2. So I want you to keep this in mind. In chapter 2, actually in chapter 1, starting verse 18, on down through where we go into chapter 3 and down to about verse 23, there is this section in there of where he's showing the condition of Gentile and Jew. And he's specifically working on the Jews because the Jews had a hard time conceiving that they were lost because of their relationship to Abraham. They had received the law and they had received circumcision. And so even to this day, Jews do not have in their vocabulary, so they tell me, the word salvation or saved. They don't even talk about being saved because they have this relationship with God, and so they don't think that they need to be saved. So Paul now is going to speak in the book of Romans about salvation by faith. The first 17 verses of the book is dealing with this, showing salvation by faith. Then starting in verse 18, down to where we get into chapter 3 and about verse 23, he's going to be dealing with the need of the Jews being saved. And then in about verse 23, he's going to get back on salvation by faith. And that then is where we'll start getting into to that doctrine, salvation by faith, in much more depth and see some great things in that particular part there. So now, he started out, and we've already learned this, that he told them here that God renders to every man according to his works. He said, those that are patient in good works and seek glory and honor and corruption or eternal life, they're going to receive it. But those that are factious, obey not the truth, obey unrighteousness, they're going to receive wrath, indignation, tribulation, and anguish. Now, the Jews, of course, would look at this, and they'd say, well, that is right, except our relationship that we have is better than the Gentiles. So what he's showing, what we've already looked at, is he said, now this is true to the Jew first and also to the Greek, that you stand in a unique relationship. You have a higher responsibility. God is going to hold you responsible for these actions because there is no respect of persons with God. God does not respect a Jew above a Gentile, trying to let them know that relationship really is not something that is going to save them. Then the question will come up with the Jew, well, what about the law? Don't we? You gave us the law. God gave us the law. Doesn't that show we are something special? The Gentiles didn't have the law. He didn't give it to them. So we must be something that is pretty special there. Then last week we spent most of our time talking about that law for us to see what it really was. Now, as you start down that line of time, when you get down to Abraham, that's when God called him and took him away from society of mankind. And first of all, they were called Hebrews. Then they were called Israelites. Then God gave them the law. Then they were called Jews. So all of those words refer to the same group of people. Now, everybody else are Gentiles. But of course, the Jews think they're something special because they have the law. Then we talked about this. What was the purpose of the law then? As we look at it, we looked at these passages of Scriptures, of which we'll not go through them again tonight, other than to say we saw that the law was not given to justify a Jew. It just plainly says that. And it demanded perfection. The law demanded they be perfect, and they couldn't be perfect. It was given to control sin. In fact, what he's actually saying is, instead of the law being given to you because you were such a fine group of people, the law was given to you because you were disobedient people. The law was given to you to try to hold you under control. That's what any law is given for, is when people are not doing what is right, then the authorities will make a law to force them to do what was right. And so Galatians 3:19 says that's what God did. Then he says in Galatians 3:24, the law was given to bring them to Christ. That's how long the law was given for. The law was never given to go through an eternity. The law was just given to bring them unto Christ. We talked about it. We paralleled it with a kid that just gets his driver's license, and so away he goes, and he takes out of here. I heard this last week about a young man. First time he got it, he goes up here and he makes a circle. He makes a corner pretty rapidly, and the police pull him over, and it's kind of a dirty deal. He got it on the first trip out. Well, what do you expect? So the authorities are going to be watching for these. They're going to be making laws. And the laws are there. Now, Dad and Mom call that boy in and say, now let me tell you something, buddy, that here is what you're going to do. And if we see them set down their teenager and say, you're not going to drive except this fast, you can only go this far, you're going to be home at this time, and start setting down these laws. Now, are they setting down these laws because this kid is so nice? Or is it because this child is disobeying? Now, another thing, when a parent tells a 16-year-old to just get his driver's license, here's what you're going to do, and this law is enforced. Well, how long is it enforced for? Everybody knows it's not forever and ever. The parent is doing this to bring the child to adulthood, to try to keep the child alive until he becomes mature enough to make proper decisions. That's what God did. God looked down upon the Jews. They were a sinful group of people. He gave them the law to hold them under control until Christ would come. So then we learn that really everything about that law was given to the Jews, not because they were such a fine group of people, not because they were a saved group of people, but he tells them it's just exactly the opposite. Now then, we see the Jews' hypocrisy and the law. And that's what we're going to be talking about here tonight. Now, before we actually look at this chart, I want us to go back because we didn't quite finish this particular section. Let's start out now in verse 11. For there is no respect of persons with God. This is Romans chapter 2, verse 11. Verse 12. For as many as have sinned without the law, this would be the law of Moses, shall also perish without the law, or the law of Moses. Now, who is it that sinned without the law of Moses? Who is it that didn't have the law of Moses? The Gentiles.
We had to cut your wireless, so could you stay near the yellow microphone?
Stay up here? Okay.
Thank you.
You sound like my wife telling me what to do. I'm used to it. You watch me obey. I'll not flicker from here on. Okay. In verse 12, for as many as have sinned without the law, that's the Gentiles, shall perish without the law. So they've sinned without the law. Now this is an interesting thing. We might scratch your head and say this. Can you sin without law? Can you break a law if there is no law? No. We're going to learn, Paul says that just a little bit later on. that if there's no law, there's no sin. But these Gentiles have sinned. These Gentiles are lost. And they're lost without the law. What law is it that they didn't have? The law of Moses. Now, did a Gentile sin when they didn't offer an animal sacrifice on the day of Pentecost? No. That law was not given to them. The Gentiles didn't sin when they didn't do what the law of Moses told them to do. But the Gentiles sinned. So scratch your head and tell me how. How'd they sin? They didn't have the law of Moses. They had to have another law, didn't they? They had to have another law. Now be real careful when I ask this next one. What law was it, Denise? A good answer. Good answer. Well, we'll get down to it right here in just a minute. I don't know. Don't know. Well, okay. Look at this chart up here for just a minute. And let me ask you a question. Go back at the very beginning when God had Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden. That's the beginning of that. And so then you go on down through, and before God ever gave the law, here you find Noah, and what had the world done in Noah's day? How bad were they? They had sinned. What law did they sin? What they had? Did they have a law? Yeah, they had a law. Was it the law of Moses? Nope, wasn't the law of Moses. Then you move on down, and you come to the 11th chapter, and you have the Tower of Babel. Did they sin? Did they break the law of Moses? The law of Moses wasn't given for another 400 and some years after that. So no, they didn't do that. So then you have Abraham coming, and Abraham lived. Now let me ask you this. Did Abraham violate the law of Moses? He couldn't, could he? Because the law of Moses wasn't given until 430 years after Abraham. So Jacob came along. He didn't violate the law of Moses. And you get down, how far do you have to get down in Jewish history before you find the Jews violating the law of Moses? You have to get down to Moses' time when he gave the law, don't you? You get down there, and so he gave the law. So now, you say, okay, quit playing games with me. Tell me what that law was. I don't know. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But I do know this. I do know that the world sinned from the Garden of Eden right on down through, and they didn't have a written law, but they had a law. They had a law. God had given the world, the Gentile world, he had given them the law, not the law, I don't want to use that. He had told them right and wrong. They had a sense of right and wrong. They knew these things, and they violated it. And so what I'm trying to point out is this, that before the law of Moses was ever given, there was law in the world. And you say, well, what was it? God didn't tell us. See? God didn't tell us of what it was that is in there. It's kind of like asking this. How did the first man speak? How did he learn to speak? Well, I guess God taught him. He may have miraculously just put it in his brain. That's my opinion. But I don't know. God, there's so many thousands of things God hasn't told us. But I know they had a law because the world had sinned so much before this. So now then, God is giving the Jews the law so they won't be like the Gentiles just running around crazy, and they will be obedient to him. So now, he says here, the Gentiles then have sinned without the law. They'll perish without the law. Those that have sinned under the law, that's the Jews, shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law that are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So he said, now this is how you're going to be judged. You're going to be judged by how you do, how you practice, how you obey the law. Now then, in verse 14, he gets into some of this interesting stuff that I don't have a lot of answers to. For when Gentiles that have not the law do by nature the things of the law, these not having the law are a law unto themselves. Now, as you look up here at this, you see up there the Jews were given the law. They had it specifically given. But now down here the Gentiles, as they go along, he says they don't have the law, but when they just naturally do what the law says, they are a law unto themselves. Now, Denise, maybe you can answer the question. What kind of law was it? It was a law unto themselves. What's that? It's a law when they do what the law of Moses said, their law unto themselves. Now, this is an interesting thing. And that is, they weren't required to offer a lamb a year old. They weren't required to do all of those sacrificial things in there. But when you get to looking at the law of Moses, you find it really is composed of various things. It first of all is composed of, now not in this order, it's composed of civil law, isn't it? Isn't there a lot of civil laws? Aren't there a lot of civil laws in the law of Moses? That if you steal my sheep, you get caught, you have to, and the penalty is there. So a lot of civil laws. Those laws wouldn't apply to them, except they'd look at it and they'd say, that's a good law. That's a good law. And in our Gentile town, not a Jew town, but in our Gentile town, we've heard how those Jews react, and we're going to hold people responsible when they steal somebody's sheep. So, they have a law. Let me ask you this question. Where do we get our laws here in America? They come from what's called Judeo-Christian, don't they? Laws of Christ and the laws of Moses. Now, here in America, do we obey the laws of Moses? No. We don't obey the laws of Moses. Well, the law of Moses says, thou shalt not kill. Do we have that law? We have the same law, see, that's here. We go back and we read those laws and we see, hey, these are good laws. These are good laws. Now we're getting into moral law, see, in the moral law. And God gave the Jews moral law in written form. Mankind has always had moral law that existed. It existed, always had it there. And we still have it today. And if you have moral law, that is how one person should treat another, if it's written down in the law of Moses, and if a Gentile who doesn't live under the law of Moses lives by the moral law, will they be the same kind of people? See? They're going to be the same kind. Now, the other kind of law is you have your civil law, then you have your moral law, and then you have your religious law. And the religious law then is you are to offer these sacrifices on these days and have these feasts and do these things in a religious sense. And of course, the Gentiles didn't do that. But what the Gentiles were doing is they were keeping those moral laws. They were keeping those laws that had to do with the action with their fellow man. And when they do that, they've got a law. They're to obey that law that they have. Now in verse 15, he said, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Now these Gentiles, when they taught you shouldn't lust, when they taught you shouldn't steal, when they taught, and on down the line, when they taught you should honor your father and mother, were they teaching the law of Moses? No. But let's read that again. 15. In that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Now, if you take the work of the law, you take somebody who's living under the law, the work of the law, what does God expect them to do? What does he expect them to do about murder? Don't do it. What does he expect them to do about lusting? Don't do it. What does he expect them to do about honoring your father and mother? Do that. Now, when the Jews do those things, they are showing the work of the law that's written in their hearts. By the way, where was the law of Moses written? On tables of stone, wasn't it? Now then, here these people have this law written in their hearts. They know these laws that Moses teaches, they're all good, and so they're obeying them. Now then, it said in verse 15, they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another accusing or else excusing them. So now here's a Gentile. He doesn't live under the law of Moses. He knows, he said, you know, it's just right. It's the right thing to do not to kill your fellow man. And it's the right thing to do to honor your father and mother. I know that's the right thing to do. I'm Gentile. All right? I'm sure that is right. So now I have that written in my heart. Now my conscience will bear witness with me. Am I doing it? I know I shouldn't kill, but I kill. What happens to my conscience? It's bad. It hurts me. I know I should honor my father and mother, but I don't. I don't care for them. What happens to my conscience? It's going to hurt me. Well, I know I should do this with Dad and Mom, but I don't do it. And it's going to bug you. Your conscience is going to hurt. So he says their conscience is going to tell them that they're right or wrong. Now, by the way, that's not a big deal, because what would tell a Jew that he's right or wrong? It'd still be his conscience, wouldn't it? When you live under the law of Christ, what does Paul say that you are to do? You are to violate your conscience? No, you're to obey that conscience. You're to do what that conscience tells you to do. Now, this always gets into something people fly off the handle. Oh, my, then conscience is the law. No, conscience is not the law. Conscience tells you it makes you feel good when you do what you believe is right. Now, when a Gentile does what he believes is right, and it is a right thing, it makes him feel good. But when he does not do what he believes is right, it makes him feel bad. And his conscience is a witness. You're a sinner. See? You're a sinner. It's no different than what it is today. Suppose somebody comes to you and they're talking to you. I wish I could think of a good example, but let's suppose that somebody comes to you and says, I want to ask you a question. I'd like to know, I don't attend all the services of the church, all the assemblies. And I'd like to know, how many do I have to attend? For instance, I went salmon fishing last Sunday morning. Do you think that's right or wrong? Now, before you go any farther, what do you know about me when I'm asking you that question? I had a hamburger for dinner tonight. And I'm not up here asking, I had hamburger. You think that might be right, or you think it might be wrong? You see. Now, last year, I didn't pay all of my income taxes. I saved about $5,000. You think that's right? What do you know about me? See, what do you know about me? You know I've got a guilty conscience, see, when I do that. For instance, today, I called my accountant and said, hey, can I do what you told me to do last year? Can I put in the $3,500 in my IRA? Yeah, sure, you go ahead, I called him last week. Sure, you can go ahead and do that. I said, now, I've been told you can't do that after 70 after you start drawing it out. Last year he said, no, it said you can put in $3,500. So I put in $3,500. So I called him this week. No, he said, I don't think you can do that. No. He said, I'll check on it, but I'm pretty sure that you can't do that. See? He said, I'll check the books, but Yeah, I don't think you can do it. I said, well, what about last year? I did it illegally then. Well, it wasn't illegal, but he didn't tell me what it was. Now, here's the whole point. You suppose I'm going to ask him any more questions? I didn't even want to hear that. Now, why will I be asking him questions? Why will I be saying, what are we going to do about last year? It's conscience, isn't it? It's going to be the conscience. See, did I do that? I don't want to pay those extra taxes, man. I don't want to pay it. But why am I even telling you the story? What do you know? See, you know, old Lowell's got a conscience that's pricking him up here. You see that he's doing that. All right, this is what this is talking about. See, this is the thing here it's talking about. Your conscience. You obey your conscience. You listen to your conscience. Now it says, and their thoughts one with another accusing or else excusing them. Take me, for instance. He calls tomorrow and he says, here's a law down here, Lowell, and it says you can do that. No problem. What will happen to me? Whew. Great. I'm excused. There's no problem. But what happens if he says, you can't do that? And I say, well, I've already done it, so I'm not going to do anything about it. And then I lay down on my pillow. See? What's going to condemn me? See? It's my conscience. Okay. What should I do in here? So that's what he's talking about. That you don't have to go to the judgment bar wondering whether you're right or whether you're wrong. You can listen to your own conscience, and it's going to tell you, are you doing what you understand is right? Of course, if you don't understand what's right, well, then it wouldn't hurt you in there. That's probably what I'll tell the IRS. And so, if you don't understand it, well, then it'd be. But he said, now, that's what happened to the Gentiles. So now when you get down here, let's look at this chart. Let's look at the chart. And you come up here, and here comes the Jews. Here comes the law. The law was in existence for a short period of time. These Gentiles have been living all this time. Did the Gentiles have a law? Yeah, the Gentiles had a law, see? And their conscience would tell them whether they were obeying it or not. Well, the Jews had a law. By the way, what would tell a Jew whether he's doing right or wrong? His conscience is going to tell him. He reads it. Here's what God says. I've done it. I'm okay. Or here's what God says. I haven't done it. I'm not okay. But so what he's trying to say is, here's all Paul is trying to say. I don't care whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. You have a law to live up to, and nobody has lived up to it. You're a sinner. So he says, your conscience will either accuse you or excuse you in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. So God now will judge the secrets of men according to the gospel of Paul. Well, let's take me in here. Will I be judged for what I do with that $3,500 last year? I will be judged, won't I? I will be judged. Now, as you look at it, you can say, well, now I know that there's something wrong. Suppose my accountant calls me and says, Lowell, you can't do what you did last year. And I say, well, I'm just going to forget it and go on about my business. That's one Lowell that'll stand there. That's one guy. But let's say I died 2 weeks ago. It's totally not on my conscience. I didn't know anything about it. Which way would you rather stand? Which Lowell would you rather have standing before the judgment bar of God? The Lowell that died last week before last, that had no idea he had made a contribution he shouldn't have made, or the Lowell maybe tomorrow, I don't know what it'll turn out to be, but the guy tomorrow, he calls back and says, you can't do that, that was illegal. And I say, well, I'm going to forget it. Whose shoes would you rather be in? See? This is what he's talking about that's in here. So it's according to the secrets here, according to my gospel. Well, according to my gospel, let me ask you this. What does the gospel of Paul, that he preached, say about paying the IRS? What does it talk about the IRS? What's that? All right, it says pay your taxes, doesn't it? See? He says pay your taxes. Wow, okay, here it is. Find out I did it wrong. Now, if I'm going to live by the gospel of Christ, what should I do then? See? So, it's pretty clear. That's what he's talking about. But now, he's showing the Jews in this section that the Gentiles have done wrong. Now, he's getting ready to show the Jews how much worse they are than the Gentiles. He says here then, in verse 17, but if thou bearest the name of a Jew, now you're wearing the name of a Jew, and you rest in the law, here, and you glory in God, here, you know his will, and you approve the things that are excellent, the things that are good, that the Bible says, being instructed out of the law. See, I've got some of these things. Being instructed out of the law, and a guide of the blind. Here these Jews would say, we know what the law says, and we even teachers of other people. See, we're a guide to the blind in here, a light to them that darkness. For all the people that are out there in darkness, they don't know the difference between right and wrong. Look at me. Look at me, I'm Jew. Well, what makes me special? I know the law of God. I glory in God. I know his will. I approve of it. I've been instructed. I guide other people. I'm a light. Okay. Building up a pretty cocky man now, aren't we? See? That's in here. And a corrector of the foolish. I even know so I can correct foolish people of what they're doing. And a teacher of babes. I'm a teacher in all of this. That's what the Jews are saying, see? And here. And I'm a teacher of others. So here's what I am. I have all of this. I'm a Jew. That's his point. Teachest thou not thyself? Now, if you do all of this, do you teach yourself? Or do you just teach other people? You don't obey what you teach other people. So here's what he's going to say. He's going to say in here, now you preach in here, then that you should not steal. Here, thou teachest that dost thou teach thyself? Thou preachest that a man should not steal. Do you steal? He's asking these Jews. Well, I'm honest most of the time. Every once in a while, your conscience going to go to work on you see? So what he's trying to say is, now you claim that you know, but I'm asking you, do you do? And of course, by knowing the Jewish society at that time, these answers are pretty self-evident. Thou teachest thou should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Yeah, pretty evident. You teach that you should abhor idols. Do you rob temples? Now that terminology, do you rob temples, is kind of unique. That word can mean two things. That word can mean, do you rob temples? Just that simple. Do you go into a temple and do you rob it? Now, if you find somebody who does go into a temple, a heathen temple, and steals their idols, what are they guilty of other than thievery? What are they guilty of other than thievery? They're guilty of not showing any respect to that religion, aren't they? And they would say, well, I don't need to show respect to that religion. That's beside the point. We're trying to get a definition of a word. If people rob temples, they're a thief, but that's not his point. If they rob temples, they're showing disrespect to that temple. It's called sacrilegious. Now, all the versions I checked, with the exception of the King James Version, says, do you rob temples? King James says, do you commit sacrilege? I think that's the best idea. In other words, do you honor the temple, your own temple? Do you behave yourself in your own temple the way you should? Here. Now you might raise the question, in Jesus' day, were the Jews, were they showing sacrilegious attitude toward the temple? Remember what Jesus told them about the temple when he cleansed it? You've made it a den of thieves. Well, when they made it a den of thieves, they were not treating it properly. They were sacrilegious. He means one of the two. I don't know which one he means. I think that it's the sacrilegious would be really the best. Now, you glory in the law, he says. Oh boy, you glory in all of these things. You say, here it is. I've got all this. But you transgress the law. Here it is, you preachers, you teachers, you're teaching this, and you're proud of it, and you glory in it. And yet, you transgress it. Now, when you do that, you dishonor God. That's the way that you dishonor God. You know what you should do, and you're not doing it. And not only that, but you cause the Gentiles to blaspheme the name of God. The Gentiles look at you, and here it is, you're teaching something, and you're practicing something else. What do you think about people who are just outright blatant hypocrites in a religious sense? They cuss, they steal, they cheat, it's very obvious, and yet they claim to be very God-fearing people. See, you have much respect for them? So, no. The greatest damage we can do today is act as though we have the truth and say, here it is, we know what Christ would have us to have. We want you to come and we want you to be like we are. We want you to be like Christ. And what would you think if it comes out in the paper then tomorrow morning? Local preacher Lowell Williams taken in the aid car out of local tavern because he fell down drunk and this or that. Well, would you just say, Lowell, you drank too much? Is that what you'd say? Would you just say, Lowell, now you know you're not supposed to get drunk? What else would you say? Now, those two things are bad enough, but what else would you say? Lowell, we got news for you. You were fired yesterday. Not next week. Not today. You were fired yesterday. We don't have a man like you. Why would you not have a man like me? Because it would cause the people to blaspheme God. See? And that hypocrisy. So that's what he's saying. That's the kind of people that you Jews really are. See, you're really that way. But then they say, well, what about circumcision? So we might not use the law properly, but we certainly have circumcision. Doesn't that make us better than the Gentiles? Let's look at circumcision pretty quickly. What about circumcision? Doesn't that make the Jews better than the Gentiles? Now, circumcision, get this is very important. Circumcision was the Jews' token, or as translations say, sign, of the covenant with God. Now, the Jews had a covenant with God. That covenant was made back at the very beginning in the days of Abraham. That here it is, Abraham, you do this, and through thy seed I will bless all nations. So now the Jews had a covenant with God. To illustrate that, it's like a man and a wife getting married. We have a covenant. I took a covenant with my wife. I said, here is what I will do. And she said, here is what I will do. And we pledged to each other we would be faithful and care for each other until death do us part. And then we put on a wedding ring. So here it is. Now you look up and you see this wedding ring. Now, what does that wedding ring tell you? As you look up and you see it on that particular finger, what does that tell you? Does that tell you I'm faithful to my wife? Does it? No. No, you don't know anything. Except when you see that wedding ring, what do you know? I'm married. I have made a covenant with a woman. That wedding ring says it's a token. I've made a covenant with her. Doesn't tell you whether I'm faithful or not, but I've made a covenant with her. Now, as we look at this, we see that's what circumcision was. Circumcision was a token, a sign of their relationship with God, just like a wedding ring is with husband and wife. Look at what it says in Genesis 17, when circumcision was first given. God said, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you, and thy seed after thee. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it," circumcision, "shall be a token," or a sign of a covenant. God didn't tell him to put on a wedding ring. He said, we're going to do something to your flesh physically, and it's be circumcision. And it is a sign of a covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every male throughout your generations. He that is born in the house or brought with money of any foreigner, that is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with money, must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. I want you to notice, I think we made it plain about it being a token of a covenant. But I want you to notice about what it was. Did circumcision make a Jew a Jew? No. A Jew is born a Jew. A Jew was born into the covenant relationship with God. And God says, when that male child is 8 days old, he is to be circumcised, and if he's not circumcised, what'll I do with him? I'll cut him off from among the people. Well, he had to be among the people to be cut off. So a Jew was a Jew when he was born. But that circumcision was the sign. And if he did not have that sign or that token, God says, I'll cut him off. Now, as we look at this, we ask the question, how can circumcision become uncircumcision? Because that's what he's getting ready to talk about right here. He said in verse 25, "For circumcision indeed profited, if thou be a doer of the law, but if thou be a transgressor of the law, the circumcision is become uncircumcision. And therefore, this uncircumcision, if the uncircumcision, that's the Gentiles, keep the law, shall not his uncircumcision be reconciled as circumcision, and not the uncircumcision which is by nature?" So we say, well, how in the world can this be? Well, let's look at it. You probably noticed Scott McClellan there, the press secretary for the president. I got that picture because he's got it up there and it's showing a ring. That's the only reason it's there. Now, when you see him hold that up and he's doing like this at a news conference, you see that ring, what does that tell you about him? He's married. Now, question, when does this ring no longer become a token? As though he never had it on his hand. It's useless. Everybody knows when that happens, doesn't it? He becomes unfaithful to his wife, running around with other women. He goes home, and his wife accused him. He said, "Honey, I've got your ring on." "Don't get upset, darling. I have your ring." How important is a ring? She'll say, "Give me that ring." And over the house it'll go. See? The ring has no meaning. It's not a token if the man becomes unfaithful to his wife. Now here's a Jewish baby that's just been circumcised, held by his Jewish mother. Now when does this circumcision no longer become a token? As though he had never been circumcised. When is it that a circumcised Jew, his circumcision is counted as though he was never circumcised? See? When does that happen? Well, let's read what Paul said. "For circumcision indeed profiteth, if thou be a doer of the law, but if thou be a transgressor of the law, thy circumcision is become uncircumcision. So if you become unfaithful to God, and you do not live up to your responsibilities in that law, God doesn't count you as his people. You're uncircumcised. Just like a woman would do a man if he was unfaithful to her. So we need to learn this in here, that under the old law, before Christ, the people of God were called Jews because of their physical relationship. So I want us to look right here now in verse 28. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. You want to show this outward circumcision that you Jews have doesn't mean much. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not of men but of God. Now he said, here is the real Jew. This is what he's going to show. Remember, these Jews were saying, I'm not a sinner because I'm a Jew. No, he's showing you are a sinner, and you're even a worse sinner because you are a Jew. You're even worse than the Gentiles because you're not living up to that standard that God has blessed you with by giving you that law. So, before the cross, the Jews were the people of God, physically speaking. Now, after the cross, the people of God are Jews spiritually. There's such a thing as Jews spiritually. That's what he says in Romans chapter 2 and in verse 28. That it's not the outward relationship that makes you a Jew. Now he's using the Jew here in an unusual way. See? He's using the Jew here in an unusual way. Jew, when they talk about Jews, that was the people of God. But that was the physical relationship. Now he says the people of God, the Jews under the new covenant, doesn't depend on your physical relationship. In Romans chapter 9 and in verse 6, he makes this statement. But it is not as though the word of God had come to naught and so forth, had come to naught, for they are not all Israel that are of Israel. Neither because they are Abraham's seed are they children. Wow. Now over here under the new covenant, all Israel is not Israel. Well, how can that be? All physical Israel are not true spiritual Israel. See? And he says it doesn't depend any longer on you being of the seed of Abraham. That's what you had before the cross. After the cross, that relationship no longer is in effect. In Galatians 3:28 and 29, there it talks about being baptized into Christ, and it says in Christ there can be neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free, and so on down the line. The distinction is gone. And in Galatians 5:6, Paul says that circumcision will profit you nothing, but faith working through love. That's what it's all about. So, as he's talking here, he's trying to show those Jews, unless you're right with Christ, you are wrong and you're a sinner. Now, we're right in the middle of this. Our time is up. But I want you to just look in chapter 3, verse 1. Well, what advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Can't you just see the Jews at this time throwing up their hands and saying, oh boy, me being of the blood lineage of Abraham is nothing. God gave me the law. That doesn't amount to anything. And I'm circumcised, and that's worthless. What advantage is there to be a Jew? That's the question. That's what he'll answer this next week. Class dismissed.